Richmond, California, October 1941. Cold wind blew from San Francisco Bay, carrying the metallic scent of steel and the bitter taste of uncertainty. Along the coast, where empty fields and abandoned warehouses once stretched, something different now rose. A shipyard born of urgency, built in weeks where others would take years. War crossed the Atlantic like a relentless storm. Each week, German submarines sent Allied ships to the ocean floor, freighters, tankers, supply transports. The numbers were devastating. More ships were sinking than traditional shipyards could build. The mathematics was cruel and simple. If this continued, England would fall. If England fell, Europe would be lost. In the ports of Baltimore and Norfolk, shipyards worked at their limit. Master craftsmen hammered glowing rivets into steel hulls, following centuries-old methods, precise, slow. Each ship took months. Tradition was respected, but tradition would not win this war. Then emerged a man without naval credentials, without the respect of admirals, without the blessing of maritime architects. Henry J. Kaiser was a builder of dams, of bridges, of roads, not of ships. When he proposed transforming shipbuilding into an assembly line, the experts laughed. Impossible, they said, irresponsible. But Kaiser saw something they could not see. Necessity does not wait for perfection, and war does not respect tradition. In Richmond, under the grey autumn sky of 1941, he would bet everything on a revolutionary idea, that compassion for human life and industrial audacity could, together, change the fate of a war. Washington, D.C. 6 months earlier, April 1941, the oak-paneled conference room of the United States Maritime Commission bore the weight of desperation disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. Vice Admiral Emery Land sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands clasped over shipping reports that told a story of impending catastrophe. Across from him, Henry J. Kaiser, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, with eyes that burned with an almost unsettling confidence. "Mr. Kaiser," Land began, his voice carrying the skepticism of a man who had spent 40 years in naval construction. "You've built the Hoover Dam. You've paved highways across deserts. But ships—" He leaned back, arms crossed. "Ships are not concrete and asphalt." Kaiser didn't flinch. "Admiral, with respect, ships are steel, labor, and time. I can manage all three." The invitation had come because desperation makes strange bedfellows. The Maritime Commission needed ships, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, and they needed them faster than the established shipyards of Bethlehem Steel and Newport News could deliver. Kaiser's reputation for completing impossible projects ahead of schedule had reached Washington, but reputation and reality, the admirals knew, were often oceans apart. "The industry has standards," interjected William Francis Gibbs, the naval architect whose designs had defined American maritime excellence. His voice was measured, professorial. Each rivet must be placed with precision, each weld inspected by certified craftsmen. The integrity of a vessel at sea depends on decades of accumulated knowledge. You cannot simply improvise. Kaiser listened, his expression unchanging. He had heard variations of this speech before, from engineers who said the Hoover Dam couldn't be built on schedule, from bureaucrats who claimed his highways would never meet deadlines. The language of impossibility was familiar to him, almost comforting in its predictability. "Gentlemen," Kaiser replied, standing now, his 6-foot frame commanding the room, "I'm not proposing to abandon quality. I'm proposing to abandon inefficiency. Right now, your shipyards are building vessels the same way they did in 1918. Craftsmen heating rivets in forges, boys running them to riveters while they're still glowing, teams of men hammering them into place. It's an art form. It's also too slow." Land's jaw tightened. "And your alternative?" "Welding, prefabrication, assembly line construction." Kaiser pulled a folded blueprint from his briefcase, spreading it across the mahogany table. "I will build entire sections of ships in different areas of the yard, bow, stern, midship, all simultaneously. Then we'll lift them with cranes and weld them together, like building a house, not carving a sculpture." The room fell silent. John Riley, chief engineer from Bethlehem Steel, laughed. A short, bitter sound. Electric welding on a scale like that. Mr. Kaiser, do you have any idea how many certified welders exist in this country? Perhaps a few thousand. You're talking about needing tens of thousands. Where will you find them? I'll train them. Train them. Gibbs leaned forward, disbelief etched across his refined features. It takes years to become a shipwright, years of apprenticeship, of learning the craft from masters. Then we don't have years, Kaiser interrupted, his voice sharp now, cutting through the genteel resistance. Every week we debate methodology. Another dozen ships go down in the Atlantic. Every month we cling to tradition. Another 1,000 sailors drown in water cold enough to kill them in minutes. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room like smoke. I can build you a ship in 6 months, then 3 months, then 60 days. His eyes moved from face to face, challenging each man present. Give me the contract, give me the steel, and give me the workers. I'll show you what American industry can do when it stops asking permission from the past. Admiral Land studied the blueprint, his expression unreadable. Outside the window, cherry blossoms drifted past like snow. Dearborn, Michigan, May 1941. Clay Bedford stood on the observation platform above Ford's River Rouge plant, watching an industrial symphony that contradicted everything he understood about construction. Below him, automobiles emerged from organized chaos every 60 seconds. Raw steel entered one end, completed vehicles rolled out the other. The precision was mesmerizing, each worker performing one specific task while the assembly line carried the growing machine forward through space and time. Bedford was Kaiser's chief engineer, a pragmatist hardened by 2 decades of building dams and bridges. He had accompanied his employer to Detroit with considerable skepticism. Ships were not cars. The ocean demanded respect that highways never required. A failed weld on a bridge might crack. A failed weld at sea meant men drowning in darkness. But watching the River Rouge plant shifted something fundamental in his thinking. The principle transcended the product. It was about fragmenting complexity into manageable tasks, about training workers for specific roles rather than demanding they master entire crafts. Henry Ford had democratized manufacturing. Perhaps Kaiser could democratize shipbuilding. See it? Kaiser appeared beside him, voice barely audible over the machinery's thunder. That's what we're building in Richmond, not ships crafted by artisans, but ships built by America. Bedford nodded slowly, his engineer's mind calculating implications. The Navy won't accept it. Gibbs will fight us. They'll say we're sacrificing integrity for speed. Then we prove them wrong. Kaiser's voice carried the absolute certainty that had driven every impossible project of his career. Electric arc welding instead of rivets, prefabricated sections, bow here, stern there, deck modules assembled separately. Then we crane them together, construction time cut by 2/3, electric welding on that scale. Bedford watched another car roll off the line. Henry, the industry has used rivets for centuries because they flex with the hull, absorb stress. Welded seams are rigid. If they fail, they won't fail. We'll test, improve, iterate. The British are already welding emergency vessels. We'll perfect the technique. Richmond, California, June 1941. The transformation happened with breathtaking speed. Where fishing boats once bobbed at weathered docks, enormous cranes now pierced the sky. The shipyard materialized in weeks, not careful traditional construction, but urgent wartime improvisation. Kaiser purchased 750 acres of marshland. Engineers drove pilings into soft earth, poured concrete slipways, erected vast prefabrication sheds. The design violated every convention. Traditional yards were linear, ships built keel up, bow to stern, in single locations. Kaiser's yard was modular, with different vessel sections taking shape simultaneously across dozens of work areas. The welding decision was most radical. Certified welders were scarce, perhaps 5,000 in the entire country. Kaiser's project needed 20,000, so he created a training program that horrified experts and embodied his philosophy. Recruit ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, housewives, and teach them one specific welding task. Not comprehensive mastery, but precise technique for their assigned station. Horizontal welds, vertical welds, overhead welds, each worker perfecting their particular contribution. Margaret Johnson was among the first recruits. A secretary from Oakland, she had never held a welding torch until Kaiser's recruiter explained that women's smaller hands often produced more precise welds. The pay exceeded typing wages. The work supported the war effort. She enrolled. Her training lasted 2 weeks. Not years of apprenticeship, not months of theory. 2 weeks of intensive, focused instruction on specific welds she would perform 8 hours daily, 6 days weekly. The experts declared it impossible to train competent welders so quickly. Margaret Johnson and thousands like her would prove them catastrophically wrong. Richmond Shipyard, Nomainchas in September 1941. The first keel laid in Richmond belonged to a vessel that would never earn a name in the history books, yet its construction would rewrite the rules of an entire industry. Hull number 440, a standard EC2SC1 cargo ship, what the Maritime Commission bureaucratically called an emergency cargo vessel, and what the world would come to know as a Liberty ship. Margaret Johnson reported to prefabrication shed C at 6 in the morning, her leather welding gloves still stiff with newness. Around her, hundreds of workers, most as inexperienced as herself, moved through the cavernous space with the uncertain choreography of opening night. Former fruit pickers positioned steel plates, bank tellers operated cranes. A jazz musician from San Francisco's Fillmore district made vertical welds that would hold against Atlantic storms. The traditional shipwrights who had been hired as supervisors watched with barely concealed horror. These weren't craftsmen. They were civilians playing at a profession that demanded years of apprenticeship. Yet Kaiser's method was undeniable in its logic. Break the ship into modules, break each module into tasks, break each task into motions that could be taught, practiced, perfected. In Shed C, Margaret welded the same seam repeatedly on bulkhead sections that would become the ship's interior walls. Horizontal fillet welds, joining perpendicular steel plates. Her torch hissed, the ark's blue-white brilliance forcing her to work behind darkened glass. Sparks cascaded like mechanical rain. After 2 hours, her arms ached. After 4, they trembled. After 8, the motion had become something approaching muscle memory. Across the yard, other workers assembled their pieces of the puzzle. The bow section took shape in one area, a massive steel prow that would split ocean waves. The stern grew in another location, its curved plates forming the vessel's aft, where propeller and rudder would mount. Deck sections, engine room compartments, cargo hold frames, all rising simultaneously in different corners of the shipyard. This was Kaiser's revolution made tangible, parallel construction instead of sequential building. Where traditional methods demanded that each section be completed before the next began, Richmond's workers built everything at once. The ship came together, not like a sculpture emerging from marble, but like a machine assembled from manufactured parts. Yet the first Liberty ship resisted Kaiser's optimism about speed. Inexperienced workers made mistakes. Welds cracked and required recutting. Prefabricated sections didn't align perfectly, demanding improvised adjustments. The foremen, many imported from traditional yards, struggled to abandon their instincts for methodical precision in favor of rapid iteration. Weeks became months. The target completion date passed, then another. Kaiser walked the yard daily, his presence both inspiration and reproach. He saw the potential in the organized chaos, recognized that each mistake taught lessons being absorbed by thousands of workers simultaneously. When Hull 440 finally slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay in early 1942, it had taken far longer than Kaiser promised. But watching it float, he saw something the skeptics missed: proof of concept. The ship worked. The methods worked. Now came refinement, acceleration, the transformation of possibility into industrial revolution. Richmond Shipyard. Nomainchas, November 1942. 14 months had passed since Hull 440's laborious birth. 14 months of relentless refinement, of workers becoming skilled, of chaos crystallizing into system. The Richmond yards now operated with mechanical precision, that would have seemed impossible in those uncertain September mornings of 1941. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. The sound of welding torches never ceased, a constant electric sizzle that became the soundtrack of American industrial might. Kaiser stood before his assembled workforce on a cold November morning, his breath visible in the pre-dawn air. Behind him, Hull 440's descendants waited in various stages of completion, 10 ships, 20 ships, an armada growing from California mud. But today was different. Today was a demonstration, a declaration, a calculated act of industrial theater. "We're going to build a ship in 4 days," Kaiser announced. The workers, nearly 15,000 strong, stirred with mixture of disbelief and excitement. Not sections, not modules. A complete ship, from keel laying to launch. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. The number was specific, deliberate. It was exactly 1 day faster than the current record, held by a British yard in their own desperate race against U-boats. Kaiser wanted that record. More importantly, he wanted the world, and skeptical admirals in Washington, to witness what American workers could accomplish. The ship would be christened SS Robert E. Peary, honoring the Arctic explorer, but its true purpose was proving a point. At 12:01 a.m. on November 8th, the first keel plates were positioned. Margaret Johnson, no longer the uncertain secretary but a confident welder with calloused hands, took her station in the prefabrication area. She had made this journey from novice to skilled laborer, and now worked with the fluid efficiency of repetition perfected through thousands of welds. Around her, an industrial army moved with choreographed purpose. The bow section materialized in 18 hours. Stern and midship sections followed in parallel, enormous steel structures taking shape under arc lights that turned night into perpetual electric day. Cranes, the massive gantries that Kaiser had positioned throughout the yard, lifted completed modules and positioned them with astonishing precision. Welders sealed the seams where these massive sections met, their torches writing the ship into existence one molten bead at a time. The traditional shipbuilders who had initially scoffed now watched in silence. John Riley, the Bethlehem steel engineer who had questioned Kaiser's qualifications, stood at the yard's entrance with a notebook, documenting what his experience told him should be impossible. William Francis Gibbs, the naval architect whose elegant designs Kaiser had adapted to mass production, observed from the Maritime Commission's viewing platform. On November 12th at 3:30 p.m., the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the ways. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes from keel to launch. The watching crowd, workers, military officials, journalists, erupted in cheers that echoed across the bay. Vice Admiral Emery Land, who 18 months earlier had questioned Kaiser's audacity, now stood watching a fully functional 10,500-ton cargo vessel bob in the water, built faster than any ship in recorded history. His weathered face showed something between amazement and reluctant respect. Kaiser had proven his point, but more significantly, he had proven that American industrial capacity, properly organized and boldly led, could overcome any limitation imposed by tradition or convention. The mathematics of the Atlantic had changed. For every ship U-boats could sink, America could now build 3. Baltimore, Maryland, January 1943. The traditional shipyards had watched Richmond's success with the careful attention predators give to territorial intruders. Bethlehem Steel, Newport News Shipbuilding, the venerable East Coast establishments that had defined American naval construction for generations, they could no longer dismiss Kaiser as an ambitious amateur with beginner's luck. John Riley returned from his observation visit to Richmond, carrying recommendations that must have felt like betrayal to his colleagues. "We need to adapt," he told Bethlehem's board of directors, his voice flat with pragmatic acceptance. Prefabrication, assembly line welding, modular construction, Kaiser's methods work. The resistance came not from malice, but from pride. These yards employed master craftsmen who had spent lifetimes perfecting their art. Men who could read a hull's curve like poets reading verse, who understood the ocean's forces through decades of intimate experience. To them, Kaiser's approach felt like industrialization at the expense of craftsmanship, quantity prioritized over quality. Yet the war cared nothing for such philosophical debates. By early 1943, Kaiser's Richmond yards alone were launching a completed Liberty ship every day. Soon that rate would accelerate to 3 ships daily, across his expanding network of facilities. The numbers were staggering, almost obscene in their productivity. Traditional yards took 4 to 6 months per ship. Kaiser's yards averaged 45 days, and that average continued falling. Richmond Shipyard, Noda 3. March 1943. The expansion consumed the California coastline like industrial wildfire. Kaiser opened a second Richmond yard, then a third. In Portland and Oregon, he constructed additional facilities. Swan Island, St. John's, Vancouver, shipyards materialized wherever land met water. Each new facility incorporated lessons learned from the last, refinements that shaved days from construction time, improvements that increased quality while maintaining speed. The workforce swelled to over 100,000 workers across all Kaiser yards. Margaret Johnson now supervised a welding crew of 30 women, teaching newcomers the skills she had learned just 18 months earlier. The turnover was constant. Workers left for other jobs, were drafted, relocated, but the system Kaiser built absorbed these disruptions. The expertise resided not in individual craftsmen, but in the process itself, in the training programs that could transform civilians into shipbuilders in weeks. Yet internal resistance persisted. Some foremen, veterans of traditional construction, struggled to abandon their instincts for methodical perfection. They saw hastily trained workers making mistakes that master craftsmen would never commit. They witnessed welds that weren't quite perfect, alignments that required adjustment, shortcuts that offended their professional standards. Kaiser addressed these concerns not through argument, but through results. Liberty ships built in Richmond crossed the Atlantic, survived storms, delivered cargo, returned for additional runs. The U.S. Navy subjected Kaiser's vessels to rigorous testing. Independent inspectors examined welds, stress-tested hulls, verified structural integrity. The ships performed. When the SS Richard Henry Dana completed 15 Atlantic crossings without significant maintenance, delivering thousands of tons of supplies to British ports, even the most stubborn traditionalists began acknowledging what the numbers proved conclusively. Kaiser's revolution worked. The industry would never return to the old methods. The question was no longer whether mass production could build ships, but what other impossibilities might yield to similar transformation. Richmond, California. Summer 1943. The transformation extended far beyond steel and welding torches. Kaiser's shipyards became laboratories of social change, places where the rigid hierarchies of American industry dissolved under the pressure of wartime necessity and deliberate innovation. Women comprised nearly a quarter of the workforce by mid-1943. Not just in traditional roles, secretaries, cafeteria workers, nurses, but as welders, crane operators, electricians, pipe fitters. Margaret Johnson's journey from Oakland secretary to welding supervisor was replicated thousands of times across Kaiser's yards. These women wore leather work jackets and protective goggles, carried lunch pails, and collected paychecks that exceeded anything available in women's work. The famous poster would emerge from these yards. Rosie the Riveter, bicep flexed, red bandana tied around her hair, declaring, "We can do it." The image became iconic, but the reality was more profound than any propaganda poster could capture. Women were proving, through molten steel and aching muscles and ships that floated, that gender had never been the limitation that society claimed. African Americans found similar opportunities in Kaiser's yards, though the path remained complicated by America's persistent racial divisions. The shipyards hired black workers in numbers unprecedented for West Coast industry. Men who had been relegated to agricultural labor or service positions now operated sophisticated machinery, learned technical skills, earned middle-class wages, yet they often worked in segregated crews, faced hostility from white workers, lived in separate housing. Kaiser, pragmatic rather than idealistic about racial equality, saw wasted potential in discrimination. Labor was labor. Skills were skills. The war demanded maximum productivity, and maximum productivity required utilizing every available worker regardless of race or gender. His yards didn't eliminate prejudice, but they created spaces where competence could sometimes transcend the era's rigid social boundaries. Richmond and Vanport, the new industrial communities, the influx of workers transformed entire regions. Richmond's population exploded from 23,000 to over 100,000 in less than 3 years. Housing couldn't be built fast enough. Workers lived in converted chicken coops, in cars, in tent cities that sprawled across hillsides. The strain on infrastructure, sewage, water, roads, schools, was immense. Kaiser responded with characteristic audacity. In Portland, he built Vanport City, an entirely new community constructed in 110 days to house 40,000 shipyard workers. Prefabricated homes, the same modular logic that built ships now building neighborhoods. Schools, hospitals, shopping centers, all planned and executed with industrial efficiency. But Kaiser's most enduring social innovation emerged from a practical problem. Workers were losing time to illness and injury. Doctor visits meant leaving the yard, losing wages, delaying production. So Kaiser created an on-site medical system, the Permanente Health Plan, where workers paid a small amount from each paycheck and received comprehensive health care in return. The model was revolutionary, prepaid, preventive, efficient. Workers stayed healthier, productivity increased, and Kaiser demonstrated that industrial success and worker welfare weren't contradictory goals, but complementary strategies. After the war, this system would evolve into Kaiser Permanente, one of America's largest healthcare organizations, serving millions of people. In the summer heat of 1943, with 3 ships launching daily and the yards operating at peak efficiency, Kaiser had created something beyond a production miracle. He had built a working model of American industrial democracy, imperfect, still constrained by the era's prejudices, but demonstrating that ordinary people, properly organized and fairly treated, could accomplish extraordinary things. The ships sailing from Richmond carried more than cargo. They carried proof that the old hierarchies were not inevitable, that the impossible was merely the difficult not yet attempted. San Francisco Bay, August 1945. The war ended not with the launching of ships, but with their sudden obsolescence. Victory in Europe, then victory in the Pacific. The urgent mathematics of Atlantic convoys became historical footnote. The last Liberty ship, SS Albert M. Bow, slid down the ways on September 26, 1945. Behind it lay an industrial achievement almost incomprehensible in scale. 2,610 Liberty ships constructed, 18 of them built in Kaiser's yards. At peak production, an American shipyard launched a new vessel every 8 hours. The Richmond yards fell silent. The electric hiss of welding torches ceased. Workers who had built armadas returned to farms, offices, kitchens, though many carried with them transformed expectations about what they could accomplish, what roles they could occupy. The women who welded steel knew they could do more than type. The black workers who operated cranes understood their capabilities, extended beyond what segregation permitted. Kaiser himself moved on to other ventures: aluminum production, automobiles, healthcare, construction. His restless energy never settled into comfortable retirement, but the shipyards remained his most visible monument, proof that one man's audacity could redirect an entire industry's trajectory. The global impact, 1950s, 1960s, the world studied what happened in Richmond. Japanese industrialists, rebuilding their devastated nation, sent observers to understand American production methods. They absorbed the lessons: modular construction, worker training systems, quality control integrated into assembly processes. Within 2 decades, Japan would dominate global shipbuilding using principles refined in California's wartime yards. South Korea followed similar patterns, their shipbuilding industry rising from nothing to world leadership through systematic application of mass production techniques. The methods Kaiser pioneered, prefabrication, parallel construction, rapid worker training, became standard practice in shipyards from Gdansk to Guangzhou. But perhaps the deeper legacy was philosophical. Kaiser demonstrated that expertise could be democratized. that ordinary people given proper training and organization could master complex technical work. He proved that innovation often comes from outsiders unburdened by industry assumptions, that speed and quality weren't inherently contradictory, that compassion for workers and concern for productivity could coexist. The Liberty ships themselves, built so quickly, mostly survived only briefly. Many were scrapped within years of the war's end. A few remained in service for decades. Fewer still survive as museum pieces, their welded seams and prefabricated sections still visible to visitors who understand what they represent. Kaiser died in 1967, aged 85, having lived to see his healthcare system serve millions and his construction methods reshape global industry. His obituaries focused on the ships, the spectacular achievement of building an armada in 4 years. But the revolution was never really about ships. It was about possibility, the human capacity to transcend perceived limitations when necessity demands and vision inspires. Steel and compassion, welded together, had changed the world.